Snyder, thank you so much for joining me today. You are the author of a great book that I just read called Shot Down, the true story of pilot Howard Snyder and the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth. It's a great book, and
Thank
I,
you.
that is a very harrowing story of your dad and how he got shot down over Belgium and everything that went in, the resistance that helped get them out of the country. And anytime I can learn anything new about World War II or resistance efforts, I love to do that. But before we get into all of that, where were you born?
I was born in Pasadena, California. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena, as was I. My dad was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and then he moved to Southern California with his family prior to starting high school at Glendale High School, where John Wayne went to high school
Yeah.
before him. So I was born and raised in Pasadena. Grew up in that area. Then went to college at UCLA. I was a diehard UCLA fan. Uh, and then after college, I always wanted to live at the beach, so I moved to Seal Beach, California, which is in Orange County and about 40 miles south of Los Angeles. So that's where my main residence is today. And then my wife and I have a second home in Sedona, Arizona. So we go back and forth between the two houses throughout the year.
Yeah. How much has I know obviously a lot, but how much has Pasadena, LA, all of that changed since you were a child?
Um, Not all that much. Pasadena is a older community, one of the older communities in Southern California, home of the Rose Bowl. So it's a really nice area, although, with these horrendous fires that we recently had in Southern California, the Eaton Canyon fire, which is kind of north of Pasadena, call it in an area of Altadena, which was just lost thousands of homes. Um, but it's a quaint area. It has a little old town historic area, but it's a pretty big city actually. But that's home to me. My both sets of grandparents lived there. We went to church there. My dad actually owned a restaurant for 10 years in Pasadena, and he was the chef there as well. So a lot of good memories in Pasadena.
Yeah, I saw in the book that you used to go, you would go in, was it an infantry uniform and would march up to the cafe and get ice cream or milkshake
Right, right.
or
Yeah.
whatever it was.
Yeah,
But
born in 1947, all the little boys always played Army
yeah,
all the time with all the war movies that came out right after, the war ended, there's just one after another. And so, we all had little toy guns and I'd dress up and we'd go to uh, the war surplus stores and buy, canteens and helmets and all this, used army gear, and out we'd go for the day playing army, playing soldier.
my son would love that. That sounds like so much. I would have loved that when I was a kid.
Yeah, back then, you didn't have to worry about anything, getting kidnapped or anything. Yeah, you just went out for the day, and they would, back then that there was just a lot of building boom going on after the war, and so you'd go into these framed houses or apartment buildings, and you'd sneak all around, and so you had lots of areas to explore, unlike today. So we had a lot of freedom back then.
Yeah. And how many siblings do you have? I know in the book you mentioned two older sisters. Were there any more after you?
No, my parents had three children. I was the boy, and the only boy, and the youngest. Actually, I wasn't planned. My mother always said it was the best mistake they ever made.
And there's an interesting story in the book of how it's not directly correlated, but essentially how you got your name. So well, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but your mom
Oh,
was pregnant
yeah, yeah.
while your dad was overseas, and they didn't know if it was going to be, a boy or girl. And he just called you Steve, little Steve, because and it was a nickname. Can you go more into that? I can't exactly recall.
Yes, well, my oldest sister, Susan Ruth Snyder, that's what his plane was named after, my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. Excuse me. And then my other sister, Nancy, was born when my dad was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mom.
Mm.
And my mother was going to originally name Nancy Carol, but then just shortly before Nancy was born, her brother and his wife had a baby girl and they named her Carol. So my mother wasn't too happy about that. So but she had to switch Nancy's name from Carol to Nancy. And then I came along and lo and behold, her brother and his wife had a little baby boy just like a week before I was born, and they named him Stephen. And she wasn't going to be denied this time. She goes, "Look, I'm not changing Stephen's name."
Yeah.
Uh, but when my dad went overseas, when my mother was pregnant with Nancy, they just always, for some reason, kind of assumed it would be a boy. And so in all the letters my dad wrote back to my mother before he was shot down, he always referred to the baby as a boy and called him the baby Steve or Stevie. Yeah. When I was called Stevie when I was a little kid by most of my aunts and uncles.
Yeah. The whole book is really very I think it's unique from most historical books that I read. So like I mentioned right before we got on the call that I have kind of a collection of historic, military history books. But you did a really good job of incorporating personal notes, letters. I think your dad had a diary that's included. And also, I follow you on LinkedIn. You post a lot of just like daily historical facts. And so you incorporate a lot of historical context into the book as well that provides kind of like a backstory. Um, and the way that you did that is so well done. A lot of times it's stilted or it can get boring, but there's a lot of fact-based information. There's a lot of action, and the letter component from your dad while he's there. I mean, it makes you kind of feel like you're there, and all of his crewmates and stuff. You kind of get to know them, and the letters from your dad to your mom are so sweet. I'm kind of a romantic, and they're so sweet, and sometimes they're funny. There were a couple of kind of like cheeky remarks that were really interesting. But the between the movies and books and everything that you read, you kind of have this very crisp image of World War II lovers that they're very buttoned up and kind of tight and formal, and it's just longing the whole time, and there's not really any personality behind it. And I think you did a really good job of making them people while also keeping the book as serious as it should be.
Yeah, I was so fortunate and so blessed that I had so much information
Mm-hmm.
uh, that I mean I had to write a book. Yeah, like you said, my mother had kept all the letters that he wrote to her while he was in England before being shot down, and you know they had these letters in a box, and I didn't ever read them until after my parents died. I just
Mm-hmm.
sat down one day and started reading these letters, and I was just blown away.
Mm-hmm.
Because the majority of guys that wrote back, their letters were mail were censored, so they couldn't say anything that might give the enemy any idea of what was going on. But my dad was really candid in his letters. Like with most guys who just said, "Well, it's cold over here, the food's lousy. Wish I was home. I hope everything's okay," and that was about it. But my dad talked about what bombing missions were like, what life
Mhm.
was like on the air base, what life was like in England and London at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And so, and it wasn't just all these, I love you, honey, and I miss you, honey, which, that was definitely in the letters. But you really got a good, insight on what it was like to be over there. And so I kind of gave you that feeling of being there. But then I had letters or written accounts from the other members of the crew who survived and came home. And then after they were shot down, the wives or mothers or sweethearts, they exchanged letters back and forth because they were so concerned about their loved one. And the excerpts from those letters are really moving and personal because you can just tell how worried and afraid they were that they might never see their son or their husband again. So that really makes it poignant. And then also, I couldn't have written a book if it wasn't for two Belgian gentlemen, Dr. Paul Delahaye and Jacques Lelot, who were young boys during the war. And they were greatly affected by it because they saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis against their family and friends. And later on in life, they became local historians and they interviewed all these Belgian people and members of the Belgian underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew, and they documented their testimony. And so they gave me unbelievably detailed information in quotes and about events that would have been lost forever without their research. So I owe them a huge debt. So I had all this wealth of information about the story.
Yeah.
And so that, I'm doing that in the book. But then as I was, kind of writing the story, I thought I would come across different things and I go, well, the story itself is all based 100% on firsthand uh, information from the people who were involved in the events that took place. I did not alter that in the slightest, or interpret it, or add my thoughts to anything. It's all just what other people said who were involved in the story, or declassified military documents that had information about the story. As you alluded to, what I added was a lot of historical information and anecdotes about and surrounding the war to put it in context and give it background, as you mentioned. So it's kind of like two books in one. You have the story of the crew going along, but then alongside of that, you have all the documenting the history, air war over Europe, the 8th Air Force, other events during World War II. So it's kind of like a novel. It reads like almost a story, but then it's a history book about the air war over Europe in World War II. And I had a fabulous time writing the book. I would, I was so into it that I would, go to bed at night and then I'd just think about the book, and then I'd wake up like real early in the morning because had all these ideas about it, the story and what I was going to write. And I'd come upstairs to my office and I'd be there till morning, till night, just working on the book. I talked with, from the time to write the manuscript, it took me about 12 months to write the manuscript. And but it was fascinating, and I learned so much too when I was writing the book, as I would uh, get an idea, or something would spark an interest, and then I'd do all this research about that, and I'd learn about different things that I wasn't that familiar with to begin with. So it was really fun writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. You've done a great job. Going back to your letters, that you said how candid your dad was and how much that surprised you. Do you think some of that, you mentioned in the book that, of course, all letters were censored, but officers were able to self-censor their letters. Do you think that that had something to do with it? If maybe he was enlisted, they wouldn't have been as candid as they were?
Yes, definitely, because my dad censored the letters of his crew. A B-17 had a 10-man crew. My dad was the first pilot, and as such, the commander of the plane and the crew. So it was his job to censor his crew's letters. And then I think another reason was not only because he was the the first pilot and the commander of the plane, but his commanding officer really liked my dad. His commanding officer was the captain of the basketball team. And my dad was a real good basketball player. And yeah, he played center, he was 6'3", which was back then was a real tall guy. Now, you're not even that tall if you're a guard, 6'3". But and they won the championship of the base basketball league. And so his commanding officer gave my dad a lot of slack because, he was helping. And my dad would kid that his commanding officer almost thought the basketball games were more important than the bombing missions that they flew. And so I think that his commanding officer gave him a lot of slack and let some of my dad's stuff go through. But it's amazing what he wrote in those letters, and it just getting firsthand, what it was like I said, at the air base in London and England at the time, what England was going through in London, being bombed by the Germans, and going in the speakeasies at night, and it was all blacked out and you couldn't see anything. And it was an exciting time for these guys. Kind of diverting here a little bit, back then the world was totally different. The United States was basically more of a rural population. Everyone didn't move to the cities. There's a lot of farming. And these guys, came from these little small towns all over the United States. And a lot of these guys, they were just out of high school or in their late teens, early 20s. And a lot of these guys had never been out of their home county. And then all of a sudden, they're halfway around the world in London, which was the most major metropolitan city in the world at that time. And so it was really exciting for these guys. My dad, it was nothing could compare with this for the rest of their lives. Just the young, because again, they're young guys. They've never been away from home, never been away from their parents or their mother. And all of a sudden they had total freedom. They could drink, they could smoke, they could chase women, something they could never do back in the States. And so, when they had their passes or leave, they were on their own and experiencing life. So it was an exciting time for them.
I liked there were a couple of references to the English women that didn't do them many favors, but I thought they were pretty funny. There is definitely a sense in the earlier letters before he really gets involved in the war effort where there's a sense of kind of adventure and excitement to it all, and you feel that sense of adventure and excitement with him. Having been in the army and an army wife and all of that, you almost kind of feel for your mom who's kind of stuck, pregnant or with a baby, and your dad's going and having all these crazy adventures. And I mean, that's how it is. But it sounds like he loved that. And that was just really interesting to read about what World War II England was like. That was really interesting.
It was a very cosmopolitan city too. And then because Europe was occupied by the Germans, you had all these people from, military personnel from other countries, like France and the Netherlands, Poland, because of the English Empire prior to World War II, covered the globe. You had soldiers from India, from Pakistan, from Nepal, Australia, all over the English Empire were there in London. So and they all had their different uniforms on. So it was a crazy place during the war.
Were you surprised when you saw the letters? I don't know, you don't really get too much into how your dad was as a father in the book. So were you surprised at how much personality he had in the letters, or was this not a surprise to you?
Um, Well, my dad had a big personality. My sisters and I always compared him to John Wayne or another actor, James Arness from the TV series Gunsmoke. My dad was a big guy. He was a no nonsense guy. Things were black and white. There's right and there's wrong. And back then, when you're a kid, you're disciplined if if you got out of line, or if you talked back to my mother, you got your mouth washed out with soap. Um, you know, Back in those days. So, but my dad was a real loving father. We were close. He was my little league coach, and he'd take me fishing, and so he was loved sports. We'd go to the UCLA football games and Rams football games together, and so a God-fearing man. My parents were strong Christians. We were raised going to church and Sunday school, and uh, to have a strong belief in God. But my dad was a voracious reader, and he always used to amaze me when I was a kid. He had a big vocabulary, and he'd come up with these words. I go, well, how do you know what that word is? But he would love to read. And my mother, went to UCLA and graduated from college. But my dad, after high school, he just went to work, and then the war came along, and he went into the service. So he never went to college. But he it did surprise me, though, these letters, because I wasn't expecting. It was like you know he was right there in the room talking to me as I was reading these letters. He could get his feelings and emotions about whatever topic he was talking about, whether it was the English or the crazy things some of his crew members were doing, or what it was like on these bombing missions and so forth. And his love for my mother, and his little baby, Susan, he was away from at the time. So there was a lot of emotion in those, and then I treasure those letters because for I didn't know they were there. I knew they were there, but I had no idea what was contained in them.
Mhm. What was that process like for you? I think there's so much, we view our parents as our parents, and as children, even if, we're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, there's kind of a tendency to think that their life starts when you're dead, when yours did. So to imagine them before you and everything that they went through, was that an emotional process for you, especially with everything that he went through, kind of all these different sources, aggregating them and putting yourself in his shoes? What was that like?
Yeah, that you make a good point, because most people never really know their parents except for them being old.
Hmm.
you know, and uh, children, can't appreciate that their parents were young at one time and had exciting lives, and had a lot of experiences. And I think because I went through this process of writing the book and the letters, that I got a much better appreciation, for my parents' lives, when they were, in their 20s, um, and living their lives as young people, and the experiences they had. Um, it's just sad that we, as we growing up, we're into our own space, and we're going to school, and then we get jobs, and we get married and have a family, and then we have kids, and we're so busy with our own lives that we really don't talk to our parents about what, or our grandparents for that matter, about what their lives were like. And I think it would really be a great thing if younger generations really got to know, their generations' lives, and what their lives and some of the adventures that they had to. Because then when they're gone, they're gone. I talked to so many people. I wish I'd asked my dad more questions about the war, and they didn't, so they really don't know anything about what their dad or their uncle or their grandfather went through in the war. So that I really gained an appreciation for that. And, I knew the story of my dad's being shot down and evading capture and things like that. But writing about it and really learning, a lot more details, I just gained a much greater appreciation for how courageous and how brave my dad was to do what he did and what very few men would have done in his situation.
Mhm.
So, and also not just about my dad, but about all those guys who in the Eighth Air Force who went up, mission after mission, not knowing if the next one would be their last one, and they'd be killed. So it was, as I said, a great experience for me, and I gained a much better appreciation for my dad and all that entire generation. They were the greatest generation.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, and not just like you were saying, his bravery, but just the fact that he survived. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but the statistics of the Air Corps, a lot of them did not come home, and so, and I mean, he almost didn't. He got shot down, and several of his crew did not. So the fact,
Yeah, as I mentioned, they have of the 10-man crew, five came home, but five did not.
Mhm.
Yeah, the Eighth Air Force, they lost more men were killed in the Eighth Air Force than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific, which is kind of hard to get grasp because the fighting on those Pacific islands was absolutely brutal.
Mhm.
26,000 men died in the Eighth Air Force, and another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their planes were shot out of the sky. Being a combat crewman in the Eighth Air Force was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military during World War II. A lot of people don't realize that. They think, fighting in the infantry, on the ground would be more dangerous, but it wasn't.
Yeah, well, a B-17 or really any plane or air asset is a tremendous asset. So what they don't include in, Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan and all of that is all the time that they spend just marching or sitting in a foxhole. That grants you kind of a life extension, but every time you go out on a flight mission, you're a primary target.
And that was another thing that was so unique about the Eighth Air Force, because they'd go out on these missions, that would just be so dangerous and so chaotic, when they're up on that plane and they have German fighters coming at them and the anti-aircraft fire exploding all around them, and there's B-17s or B-24s going down next to them, or it's total chaos. And then they come back, land, and they go to the pub, and have a few pints or try to chase women or whatever they do, and they go sleep in a cot back at the base, and they're totally away from the war for a few hours, and then they go back into it again. So they're just going back in and out, of terrorizing situations, and then fun situations, if they had to pass into London or in the little local village there in England.
Yeah, it really is. It was a unique assignment for sure. Last question about writing the book. So you said once you found the letters, that's when you decided that you just had to write this book. You, you're a great writer. Um, Number one,
Oh,
I know you
thank
said
you.
you were in sales before. Did you have any writing training or experience, or this was just like what we say like first time go for you?
Yeah, no, I didn't have any training or writing background at all. I did like to write. During, I wrote a lot of marketing materials and things like that. And so I always liked writing. Um, and I write basically just the way I talk. I've read, a lot, you read all these books, and some books, it takes an author, half a page to describe that it was a sunny day. And, you know, I just state the facts pretty much. Yeah, I don't get into all this flowery language. I don't have that ability. I'm not creative at all. You know, I'm German, and you know, I'm just just the facts, man. And so as I mentioned earlier, you know, I didn't embellish anything. I just wrote what I thought was interesting, and you know, I was blessed. The story just really tells itself. It's such an incredible story. You know, that happened to, you know, but anything that could happen to a crew happened to my dad's crew. And I mean, I didn't have to make up anything. You know, I could never write a fiction book. I'm not creative enough to just to make up stuff. So it's definitely you know, nonfiction is what. And from you know, my all my dad's letters, and I had all this information that these two Belgian gentlemen gave to me. You know, because when they interviewed these Belgian people, you know, they wrote down what they said, you know, and so I had quotes from them, and it made my job really easy. My main task was just you know, you know, bring all this information together and write it in a fashion that it flowed, and it was you know, it'd be easy for the reader uh, to follow it.
How
So,
long did it take you to write?
and well, one thing also, when I finished the manuscript and I sent it to these uh, people that, you know, to audit it or edit it, I thought, oh gosh, they're going to come back and they're just going to be crossing out things left and right, and you know, they're just going to destroy this thing. And they sent it back to me, and they hardly touched it. Really, all they did was, you know, correct some punctuation maybe, or some spelling, but they didn't change the text really at all. And I was amazed, and I asked them about it, and they go, well, no, you know, you did a great job, which was, I guess I had some inherent ability to put all the information down in a readable fashion.
Yeah. Yeah, you really do. How long did it take you to write the book? I know you spent a year
Well,
on the manuscript.
well,
You spent,
from the time I started my research to the time the book was published was 4.5 years. And then of that time, about 12 months was actually writing the manuscript. But I was doing research as I was writing the manuscript and adding the little things in. Because if my dad would talk about something in one of his letters that I wasn't familiar with, I'd research it. And I go, oh, you know, that's kind of interesting. And I thought, well, if I think it's interesting, maybe other people would think it'd be interesting. So I'd put in the book.
Mhm.
Um, so there's lots of little anecdotes about things in the book that that I think kind of just add to the interest besides the story itself.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the notes that I thought was funny, you know, I mentioned the English girls earlier. Um, there was a note that I think it was in a letter from your dad. I don't think it was like a contextual note um, that said that the chaplains had been told to deny marriages the first time that they were asked, in case like the soldier was just kind of in a bind, and then he could go back and say, well, sorry, my command said no, can't do it. I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, well, probably, you know, they got some of these guys got carried a little away, you know, in a war situation like that, you know, your emotions are quite a bit more intense than in just, you know, regular peacetime civilian life. And so they wanted to avoid these guys making a mistake, you know, and marrying somebody just off the cuff. So that was one of the reasons. So if the guy was just kept on it and kept on it and kept on it, you know, they had to prove that he was serious about this, and it just wasn't a fling or something like that.
Mhm. So you made a comment a few minutes ago that you're German, and in the beginning of the book, they go a little bit into your dad's background and his ancestry, and it says that he, you guys are German. He comes from a German lineage. It also says that there were family members that fought in the Revolutionary War. How recent was that German ancestry?
Oh, well, my dad's grandfather, maternal grandfather, was born in Germany. And so they he lived real close to them in Nebraska and moved out to California with them. So his grandfather and his parents spoke, German in the home. Uh, so it was pretty close on the maternal side.
Mm.
The paternal side of the Snyders, um, they came over prior to the Revolutionary War, and that's how I have, relatives or ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. I have three men, ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. So the Snyder side itself came, in the 17 or the 1800s, 17 before the Revolutionary War started. But on the maternal side, as it's reaching, and it's my great grandfather, my dad's father. Carl Zelo was his name. my dad's mother's last name was Zelo.
Was he still alive in like the 1930s when all of this kind of started to kick up?
Yeah, I never met Carl Zelo, my grandfather. He died before I was born.
I'm just curious about what he would have thought about his son-in-law. Well, first of all, what Germany was doing and his son-in-law being in the Air Force,
Yeah, I'm trying to. I forget off the top of my head. I think his grandfather died. Yeah, his grandfather died before the war started.
Mhm.
Um, my dad was born in 1915, so that was just a couple of years before World War One ended. Um, so I don't know. That'd be interesting. I wonder what Carl Zelo thought about World War One.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but he came to the U.S. I think in 1880 something.
Well, and
I
also
mean,
did,
yeah, 1880. I mean, yeah, 1880 something.
yeah. So what he thought about World War One, but also if he suffered any, persecution because so many German Americans were targeted during World War One.
Yes, yeah.
Um, so your dad was born in, it was the East Coast. I can't remember what state was it? Pennsylvania, New Jersey,
Nebraska. The
Nebraska.
Snyders
Either one.
originally came from Pennsylvania.
Okay, that's where
Yeah,
Pennsylvania is coming in. And then they moved to California, correct? Most
right.
parents
Right
did.
before he started high school. So like in 1929.
It said that your grandfather had a nervous breakdown and that's why they moved. Do you know why or what that was?
No, I don't, unfortunately, I don't. Yeah,
Okay.
he was a salesman, and I vaguely remember my grandfather. He sold clothing, and we'd drive him down to the Southern Pacific Railway Station in downtown Los Angeles, and he'd have these big trunks, like steamer trunks, full of merchandise that he would go back east on these business trips, taking the train, and then we'd come back, after a week or whatever. We'd pick him up at the train station. That was a big thing for us little kids to go down and pick up our grandfather. We called him Baba.
And what year did they move to California again?
1929.
Okay, so this is pre-Dust Bowl, pre-Great Depression, so that's not what triggered it.
Yeah. Well, that could have had something to do with it, the depression.
Yeah.
Uh, so I really don't know.
Um, so how did your parents meet?
They met and at a church youth group in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They had back then what they call Waltherly, which was a, a youth social kind of group within the church where the young people, would get together and do activities and have Bible studies and things like that. And so they met at Waltherley and started coding. My mother had three sisters and a brother, and my dad actually dated another one another one of my mother's sisters first before I guess my mother caught his eye, and then he switched over and started dating Ruth Hempel. Yeah, my mother's maiden name was Hempel.
Hopefully there were no hard feelings in the family.
No, I don't think my dad and her name was Jay or Jalila, was actually, one of these old-fashioned names. I don't think they were all that serious. They were more of a kind of like just dated as a group. And I forget the guy that my dad was. I mean, my mother was dating at the time, off the top of my head. But I guess they were, weren't that really serious. It was just more of, to go out and go to the movies or go to the beach or have a soda or something like that.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you mentioned that your dad had a few kind of odd jobs here and there. He played basketball. But I thought it was interesting that he joined the army in 1940 before
41.
41. Oh, okay. I thought it was 40.
Yeah, that was a result of the first peacetime draft in September of 1940, implemented by President Roosevelt. And so he entered enlisted in April of 1941, and
Okay.
then he went into the army. He was in the infantry, actually, before he went into the Air Force, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, for a year. But he went in April of 41, and then my parents got married in July of 41, 3 months later. And then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 41. And the United States was at war. And my mother was very scared and frightful. The future was so uncertain. So that Christmas, she went up to Washington, the state of Washington, to visit my dad. And she got pregnant. 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born.
Mhm.
And so my dad was concerned at the time how he's going to support his family. He has a new bride, a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could do that very well on a private's pay in the army. So he decided to join the Air Force where he could make more money, especially if he could make it through, pilot training and become an officer. So that's why he went into the Air Force, just to make more money.
So did they just allow you back then to just switch over? There was not like he didn't have to get out first and then re-enlist into a different branch. He just, which of course the Air Force at that time was still a component of the Army. It hadn't been officially separated.
Right. Yeah,
So I
it
don't
was
know
the
if
Ar-
that's,
it was the Army Air Force.
yeah.
So it wasn't really switching branches at that time, as you say.
So he just had to essentially, like, if you want to go to be a warrant officer now, you have to drop a packet and request it, and then there goes through a process and you get approval that way.
Yeah, and back then, right at the beginning of the war, it was a lot. I don't think they had as much red tape and bureaucracy. You know, things were pretty moving pretty fast back then, and so they were looking for pilots. They had plenty of grunts, and guys that they could shove in the infantry. So uh, there weren't that many commercial pilots or general aviation pilots at that time. You
Mhm.
know they airplane flight was a relatively new thing back then. So didn't have any really, trained pilots. They had to train all these civilians to become pilots. Pilot training was really tough. 40% of the guys that started, the cadets that started pilot training washed out because it was tough both mentally and physically. They had to take all these college type courses, physics, meteorology, um, and so you had to be sharp both mentally and physically to make it through. And so the guys that washed out of pilot training, they became navigators or bombardiers or maybe gunners.
Mhm. And what was the commission process like back then? Because I think you had to be an officer to be a pilot. So just as when you finished flight school, that's when you became an officer.
Yeah, there was three stages of pilot training: primary, basic, and advanced. And as you moved through, those three stages, the planes you flew got more complicated. And then, once you graduated from advanced pilot training, which my dad did in April of 1943, you earned your, pilot's wings and your commission as a second lieutenant. And then the bombardiers, the navigators, and the pilots were all officers.
Mhm.
And it's kind of funny, and I've never really been able to discover this because all these guys became pilots, but then some became first pilots, like my dad, and then some became co-pilots.
Mhm.
And really, the co-pilots flew the plane almost as much as the pilots did on these combat missions because it was so tiring. These missions lasted 6 to 10 hours in length. But how they picked, the pilot versus the co-pilot, I've never really gotten a definitive answer on how that was done. I don't know if it was just random or it was based on personality. My dad uh, was considered an old guy. He was 28 years old. Most of the pilots were in there, maybe 22, 23, around in there. And my dad was married. He had a child. He had been working for several years before going in the army. So my dad was pretty mature, much more mature than a lot of these guys. Maybe that's why they made my dad a first pilot. That's just conjecture on my part, though.
Yeah. Um, at what point do they get assigned the type of plane that they're going to be flying?
That was after my dad graduated from pilot training. Then from there, you either went to bombers or you went to some guys went to transports, the C-47s and C-45s. But my dad was assigned to transitional training, they called it, where he learned how to fly a four-engine B-17 bomber.
Mhm. And did they get assigned their entire crew at that point where like they would all train together?
Not at that point. First, they'd go to transitional training, uh, where the pilots will learn how to fly, the bombardiers will learn, how to drop the bombs, navigators would practice navigation. So they'd go to specialty schools. And then once where they supposedly uh, learned their specialty, then they went to operational crew training, where the various members of the crew came together and they learned to operate as a team. They'd go on practice missions around the country. And then once they were deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations.
Mhm.
And then my dad and his crew were assigned to the 306 bomb, well, the European theater, to the 8th Air Force and the 306 Bomb Group, which was based at Thurleigh, England, which is about 60 miles north of London.
And am I correct in understanding that for the most part the crew stayed together? There could be like one or two movements, I guess, unless, something happened. For the most part, they stuck together all the way through.
Yes, the, and my dad went to operational crew training at Pyle, Texas, and Dalhart, Texas. And there were two guys on his original crew in training down in Texas that didn't end up on his crew. And I always wondered what happened to those two guys. And I tried to research their names, but could never really find out. But one day I was reading, I've read a lot of books about the air war. I was reading a book about this one crew, and lo and behold, their radio operator was the guy that was the radio operator of my dad's originally assigned crew. And in this book, they said my dad kicked him off his crew because he was kind of he would goof around. And evidently, my dad didn't think this guy was taking it seriously, or it's kind of I or a kind of a goof off, but my dad kicked him off his crew, and I don't know if he kicked that second guy off his crew or not. But being the commander of the crew, he had the authority that if he didn't like somebody in his crew, didn't want him, he could kick him off. And so I did find what happened to this one guy. But on this other crew that he was assigned to, they said, he was a good crew member. So I guess he learned his lesson, and he got more serious or what have you. And he made it. He was shot down, but he made it through the war.
Oh,
So that
good.
was that was kind of interesting. But I think, if the commander, the first pilot was happy with his crew, they did stay together, uh, unless one of them, someone was killed or seriously injured, and they had to have a replacement.
Yeah. Going back to something you said a second ago about pilots, first pilot and co-pilot, George Ike was the co-pilot for most of the time when your dad was flying. I think there were a few that he did not, correct?
Well, actually, um, because of two factors, the English weather was miserable. It was always cold, uh, rain, sleet, snow. So guys were getting sick all the time. They'd get, the flu or pneumonia. And so a lot of times they would be in the hospital. And then if they went on the main crew went out on a combat mission, they have to get a replacement gunner or something, uh, or a bombardier. And my dad wasn't happy about the fact that when they got there, they pulled George Ike off his crew to fly co-pilot with another first pilot who I guess wasn't that good of a pilot. They wanted George to fly with this guy to kind of help this guy become a better first pilot. Why he became a first pilot, I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, and then because of guys getting sick and then guys getting injured, my dad's belly gunner, ball turret gunner, was injured on a mission, and he couldn't fly for a couple months. My dad had a waist gunner that got frostbite real bad. He was in the hospital for 2.5 months. My dad had different guys coming in and sub in, so. Uh, of the 8 missions that my dad flew, he only had his full crew on the last 2 missions.
Mm.
A lot of times people think, well, this crew, they flight every, mission together, but that was seldom the case, at least earlier in the war. Later on in the war, after the Luftwaffe got decimated by the 8th Air Force and they didn't have to deal with enemy fighters anymore, it wasn't quite as dangerous. And then you had more guys um, flying as a full crew on most of their missions.
Mhm.
My dad, he tore the ligaments in his ankle playing basketball, so he couldn't fly for 2 months, which really uh, irked him. So some of the other crew members had a lot more missions than he did, and some had fewer missions. Guys that were sick or injured on combat missions. So yeah, he couldn't fly for 2 months, so that's why he only had 8. Some of the other officers, like the bombardier and the navigator, they had 11 or 12 missions before they were shot down. So they had different number of missions, and then some of his gunners only had about 5 missions uh, before the crew was shot down.
Mhm. Before we move on to the actual, I guess, deployment, there is a funny note of when they were flying the plane over before they went across the ocean, that they were going over George Ike's house, and he found out that they're going to be flying over it, and his dad painted like a 4-foot sign or something. Can you tell that story? It was so funny.
Yeah, actually, I got that. That was an article in the local newspaper that George Ike's nephew sent to me. During my research, I went on a quest to find relatives of all my dad's crew, which I did. And I asked them for any information that, pictures, letters, newspaper articles to help me because I didn't want the book just to be about my dad. I wanted to be as much about the entire crew as possible. And so I wanted to write about these guys. And I and some people gave me a fair amount of information about their relative, and then other crew members I didn't get that much, which was I was disappointed in because I wanted to be really give as much information and background about each guy. But anyway, the article, the local paper about George's dad, Durwood Ike, yeah, he was all excited that they're going to be flying over. And this happened occasionally when guys were going to be flying over their relative's house or their parents' house just by circumstance. But yeah, he got up on the roof and put this four-put, and about, Ike Airport. And he was up there, waving his arms, almost falling off the roof. He was so excited, that his son was gonna fly over, and they came down low and, uh, rotated their wings a little bit. And so that was a big thing. So it made the local paper. Yeah, a lot of little funny things like that that happened.
I loved that story. It made me laugh.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was so sweet and so just human and funny.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's and other little things like that were in my dad's letters that are pretty humorous.
Yeah.
When he was talking like about the girls in Newfoundland when they were there.
Yeah, those are also funny. Um, so you said a minute ago that your dad flew 8 combat missions. I know, first of all, he did, am I correct that he had to fly a few as a co-pilot first before he was allowed to be first pilot overseas? But was that just in England before like when he was kind of training and before he started doing the combat missions?
Yes, yeah, the first pilots, they had him fly a mission or two as a co-pilot to a first pilot. They had combat experience.
Mhm.
So, they just didn't throw him into the fire right away, that he could kind of learn to see what the first pilot, the experienced pilot, was doing and get pointers and tips from him before then he then took over his own uh, plane. They all, even though they were planes, they all, I don't know exactly why, but they call him a ship. He always
Yeah,
referred to his plane as a ship.
that's fun. I had never heard that before.
Yeah.
That was different for me. Did those, so you mentioned also in the book, which I also did not know, that after 25 combat missions, they could go home. Did these 2 missions, did they count towards that 25?
Yes, yes. When the Air War, the Eighth Air Force first started flying missions in August of 1942, there were no mission limits. And the morale of these guys quickly went into the tank because they realized they'd never ever make it home. They'd
Mhm.
either be killed or they'd be shot down and become a prisoner of war. And so in the spring, in April of 1943, the flight surgeon in the 306 bomb group, my dad's bomb group, he determined that there had to be a mission limit because the morale, they had that guys had to have some hope that they'd ever make it home. So he wrote a letter to the commanding officer, Ira Aker, and suggested a mission limit of 20. Ira Aker set it at 25, but at least they had a light at the end of the tunnel, and some hope of making it home. Although in 1943, it was so bad that it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown before being shot down in 1943 was 6.
Wow.
But at least they had some hope, and then eventually in 1944 it was raised to 30, and then up to 35. Again, with the Luftwaffe being decimated, it became not quite as dangerous, so they increased the mission limits from first 25, then the 30, then the 35. Jimmy Doolittle did that.
Mhm.
But at the time my dad was flying, it was 25 missions. And that's all he thought about, in those letters he'd write home, he goes, okay, I got another mission under my belt. Yeah, I'm that much closer to coming home. And so he wanted to fly, those missions as fast as he could. And something that really was an aggravation to all the crew members, that because the weather was so bad in England that a lot of times they'd get in their planes, they'd go out on the runway, and because the weather would be lousy, they couldn't fly the mission, and it'd be scrubbed. That's the term for it.
Mhm.
Or if you went up and you had a mechanical problem and you had to turn around and go back to England, you didn't get credit for a mission for that. And it really was really wearing on these guys' nerves, because if you're told the night before you're going out on a mission, okay, you're getting yourself all geared up for it. Your adrenaline's coming up the next morning. You get up early, you go to a briefing, you get in your planes, you warm them up, you're out on the runway, you're all ready to go, all keyed up, and then the mission's scrubbed,
Mhm.
and then just totally deflated. And so my dad and all the crewmen hated when missions would get canceled or scrubs. That was really an irritation for him.
Yeah, well, I imagine it's a humongous just cortisol crash, basically. You've got all the
Right.
anxiety and fear and worry, and your stress builds up, and you're anticipating this for, a day, 2 days, however long, whenever they get the briefing. Which I know there were, I think, 8:30 meetings. I don't know if that's when they got them every day, but yeah, and then it just gets canceled, and all of that comes crashing down. And in a way, you're relieved, but then in a way, you're also kind of not, because now that's one mission you don't get to fly.
Right.
It doesn't
Yeah.
count.
You're just gonna stay in England, that much longer.
Yeah. Going back to
So
the
when my dad was there, he arrived in at Thurley at the base on October 21st of 1943. So it was just heading into the winter months. In October, he flew his first mission on November 3rd of 43. So November, December, January, February, the weather was particularly bad, at that time of the year.
going back to the 25 combat flight limit for redeployment, was that was that basically just what the modern army calls like dwell time, where they would just get to go back for, I mean, no one did it, I don't think. I think there was a story of one guy that made it to, he was on his 25th flight, and then he died.
Right.
The plane crashed and he died. Was this just dwell time back in the States for a few months, or were you just done and you could be out and be a civilian again?
Um, you could get out, or you could be deployed, and uh, if you were a pilot, you might come back and be a B-17, flight instructor,
Mhm.
or if you were a gunner, gunnery instructor, things like that, or go into the reserves. At that time, all the guys went in the reserves.
Mhm.
So they would, because Japan still needed to be defeated uh, after the Germans were defeated, so they wanted to maintain their force. They would go back into the reserve if they weren't on active duty.
Mhm. One thing that I did not realize was how dangerous the ocean crossing from the US to Europe was for these planes. I think you put the statistic in the book. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I think everyone in your dad's group made it over there okay. But there was a friend of theirs that had gone over just before that had died, just been lost and never found.
Yeah, because well, there are various routes. A lot of guys, went over by ship.
Mhm.
Not everyone flew their planes over there. Uh, so they go over on the Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth. Then they had a northern route that was out of Canada. in Newfoundland, and they had flying the northern route over, and there was a southern route too. But they flew at night, and they had never flown that distance before, from Canada to the UK. So that was a long flight, and it's at nighttime. And my dad said, it's pitch black, so you can't tell, the sky from the ocean. You're flying in clouds, so it was pretty nerve-wracking. Plus, my dad said the navigator, Benninger, did a great job of getting them there, because they ended up to where they were supposed to be, because it was pretty hard to navigate. But guys, yeah, the planes just disappeared, and no one knew what happened to them. They could get disoriented, and all of a sudden just go down and into the water, not realizing where they were. Or if they had a mechanical problem, there's no place to land until you got to Greenland or Iceland. So yeah, the planes did get lost, and so that was pretty nerve-wracking for them, flying over to England.
I can remember in the 90s and early 2000s, the Discovery and the History Channel were both obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle. And there was just nonstop Bermuda Triangles documentaries for some reason. And one of the ones that always fascinated me was that squadron that went missing in the Bermuda Triangle. It was 3 or 4 planes. I'd not read about it in probably 15 years now, so I can't remember the exact details. But yeah, just like that, it was a whole group of planes, and they all just disappeared.
Right, right.
So I guess before we move on, this is a good time to talk about what the B-17 is.
Okay, it was nicknamed the Flying Fortress because of the armament it had on the plane. It had 13 50 caliber machine guns that could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. It got the nickname from a newspaper guy up in Seattle when they first rolled the B-17 out. It was so big at the time and had all those machine guns. He goes, well, this is a flying fortress, and that name stuck. And also, a B-17 could take a tremendous amount of battle damage and continue flying. It would much more so than a B-24. The B-17 was constructed very sturdily, and had a 10-man crew. As I said, they had 4 officers. You had the pilot, the first pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier who were in the nose of the plane. And then up above the 2 pilots, you had the flight engineer, and he also manned the top turret when they were attacked by enemy fighters. And then behind him was the bomb bay. And then behind the bomb bay, you had a radio operator. He had the most comfortable position on the plane. It had his own room, a chair to sit at. And then below him was the most cramped position on the plane, the ball turret gunner. He climbs in this plexiglass ball, and he's in a fetal position for hours on end. These missions again were 6 to 10 hours in length. And so he was in this fetal position for a long time, which was pretty uncomfortable. And then up above him, behind the operator, were 2 waist gunners on either side of the plane, which was the most exposed position on the plane. And then the last position, another cramped position in the back of the plane, the tail gunner. So you had 4 officers and then 6 enlisted men who were mainly gunners. The radio operator also had a gun on top of his ceiling that he could fire. That really wasn't all that useful, however. And so there were 3 different models of B-17s that were flown in the European Theater of Operations. The first was the E model, but they only made about 500 of those, so that was quickly phased out by the F model. And then it was phased out in the fall of 1943 by the definitive B-17 model, and the last one, the G model. And you can always tell the G model because that has a chin turret underneath the nose of the plane. So there are 2 50 caliber machine guns coming out of the chin turret which the Bombay or the bombardier would operate if they were under attack by enemy fighters.
Mhm.
And that's the one you see in all the movies, the one with the chin turret. And that was the G model is what my dad was shot down in on February 8th of 1944. The 8th Air Force, there was 3 air divisions in the 8th Air Force. 2 of them, the 1st Air Division and the 3rd Air Division, flew B-17s. And then the 2nd Air Division flew B-24 Liberators.
And do they always fly in formations, right?
Yes, yeah, that was called a combat box formation. Um, oh, come on, I'm trying to think of the commander. His name slips uh, my mind here. I'm in a senior moment, I guess. I'll think of it in a minute. Came up with the combat box formation, and they would fly, all these. Well, 3 planes would form an element, a 3-plane element, and these elements would form up into bomb squadrons, and then bomb squadrons would form up into bomb groups, then bomb groups would form up into combat wings, and then combat wings would form up into air divisions. So on a mission, you could have hundreds of planes flying in these formations, and they flew in tight formations close to each other to ward off the enemy fighters so they couldn't come in. And the tighter formation you flew, the more protection you had from all that interlacing firepower from all the other guns from the other bombers. And so that was an effective means. And at the beginning of the war, 8th Bomber Command thought that all these bombers, heavily armed, flying in these tight formations, could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. But unfortunately, that was not the case. As I alluded to earlier, in the early years of the war, especially in 1943, the 8th Air Force took devastating losses because they could not defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. And even when they realized, well, they needed U.S. fighter support, the fighters at the time in the early stages of the war didn't have the fuel capacity to escort the bombers all the way into Germany and back again. They could escort them across the English Channel, but then they'd run low on fuel and have to turn around and go back to their bases in England. Well, the Luftwaffe, excuse me, would just wait until those U.S. fighters returned to their bases, and then they just swoop in on these bomber formations. And some of the bomb groups flew better formations than others, and that resulted, of the tighter formation, the fewer losses you had, and the looser formations, it allowed those enemy fighters to come in and shoot bombers down, and you'd have more losses. That was another thing that these pilots had that made flying combat so tiring that they had to really stay alert at all times because they flew so close to each other. If they lost their concentration, they could clip a wing on the plane next to them or run in the plane in front of them and go down. And plus, the pilots had to constantly fight the turbulence. You had the normal weather turbulence that, you get bounced around in because of the weather, but also they had to fight the turbulence of all those bombers being in such close formation to one another. The wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air up like being in a washing machine. So it really took a lot of muscle to fly those planes back then. And that's why the first pilot and the co-pilot, every 15 minutes would trade off flying the plane so they could get a little rest.
Yeah. Yeah, I was surprised by the number of casualties that the 8th Air Corps took just from accidents from these flight patterns, and that was surprising.
Yeah, they lost a lot of planes and a lot of men just in training, both in the U.S. and they trained. If they didn't go out in missions, they continually trained flying in formations, in England. Um, but they were midair collisions, all the time, or crashes on takeoff. Uh, and when they went up on these missions, as I alluded to, you had hundreds of planes taking off at the same time. And back then, there was no air traffic control. There was no radar, and usually the weather socked in, so they couldn't see anything until they got above the cloud layer. So midair collisions were not uncommon on all these planes trying to form up, where planes would go down and men would lose their lives. And it would, because of all these planes had to form up and into bomb squadrons and bomb groups and wings and divisions. It took like an hour to 2 hours to form up before they could even head across the English Channel and begin their mission. So they had to put up with a lot, plus the elements. These planes weren't pressurized back then, so above 10,000 feet, they had to go on oxygen, or in a couple minutes, they'd pass out and they could die from anoxia. And then it was extremely cold at the altitudes they were flying. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So frostbite was a huge problem. And, many airmen are hospitalized for lengthy periods of time, like one of my dad's waist gutters. You touch metal and your flesh would just stick to the metal. It was so cold up there. So and then they had to deal with enemy fighters. Then they had to deal with any aircraft fire. So they had to go through a lot.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I read that made it even more difficult, because they do have to stay in that tight formation, if one goes down, they're kind of helpless. The others can't come back for you. So assuming that the plane goes down and you shoot out and survive, you have to just hope that an allied fighter is going to see you, or a resistance member is going to find you, and you're going to be rescued somehow. But one thing that you mentioned was just kind of the heartbreak of watching everyone just fly away.
Yeah, if a plane had, mechanical issues, an engine went out, or they had, battle damage, and they started losing airspeed, then they would lag, have to fall out of the formation. And that's when the German fighters would just, like lions or wolves would, pick off the wounded one or the unhealthy animal, here they're picking off the wounded, the bomber, and they, if you fell out of formation, your odds were not good of making it back to England. But as you said, these formations, they just had to keep going, toward their mission. And then, you'd see, bombers or, friends and of a fellow, another crew being shot down, or that bomber getting hit by flak and exploding and just basically disappearing, or you knock off a wing and that bomber would just drop like a stone to the earth, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, another thing I never considered was if you do crash before you make it to your target and you don't drop the load that you were supposed to drop, and you go down. There, you mentioned an individual, a pilot that I don't remember if it's the one that I brought up earlier, that this was his last flight, or if it was one of his last flights, where he goes down and he's like desperately looking for a clearing because his plane is fully loaded, full of explosives, and there's a village nearby, and if it goes down, it can decimate like an entire area. So he courageously lands his plane in a way that will not destroy everything within a certain, I don't know how far out it would have killed everybody, but of course he lost his life. But I don't know
Yeah.
how often stuff like that happened, but that is an extraordinary act of courage when you think he could have just parachuted out.
Yes, but then his plane could have come down, in a populated area and killed
Mhm.
all these villagers. Yeah. And there were pilots that, they stayed in the plane and kept the plane flying so the rest of the crew could bail out. And then the plane exploded, and, he lost his life where it ditched in the English Channel. And, he wasn't couldn't be rescued. And, yeah, just tragedy after tragedy, you know, and even the bombers that made it back to England after a mission, they faced all sorts of dangers because the weather could be bad, the clouds could be obscuring their bases. They can't even find their bases to land. They could be running out of fuel. Uh, there could be dead or injured pilots on the plane. The plane could have a lot of battle damage. Engines out, flight controls shot out, and so crash landings would have to take place where more men would lose their lives. So, yeah, until it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they finally landed.
Mhm. And so your dad flew 8 missions. What were those missions?
Well, they were various. Some of them were occupied France, you know, and some of them were into Germany itself. His first mission was to Wilhelmshaven, Germany. That was the first time the Eighth Air Force had put up over 500 bombers on a mission. The most bombers ever be on a mission was December 24th of 1944, where 2,000 bombers hit targets around Berlin, which it's hard to even grasp, you know, 2,000 B-17s and B-24s, you know, are hitting one target, you know, when some of the planes are dropping their bombs, other bombers hadn't even taken off from England yet. You know, just a constant stream of bombers going overhead.
Mhm.
That must have been an incredible sight. It must have been a great one for the people in the occupied countries, but a horrifying one for Germans who were in the Berlin area.
Yeah, it's like the D-Day of the air.
Yeah.
So when he flew his last mission, can you talk about that?
Yeah, my dad, he wrote in his letters that after the first couple of missions, he wasn't really uh, frightened or scared to fly missions. Um, because he wanted to get the missions over with to begin with. But you know, once you're up there, you're so busy, you know,
Mhm.
flying in the plane, and you got a job to do, and you're so focused on that that you know, and the adrenaline's running through your body that you know the fear kind of just goes back into your head. Um, so the last mission was on February 8th. It was, you know, it's funny. My dad wrote that he and the other officers went out to the Falcon Inn, uh, or pub near the base there, and they tied one on, and they all were hung over the next morning. But once they went up and got on that pure oxygen, it sobered them right up.
Mm.
And the Falcon pub is still there today, and I've gone over there and gone into the Falcon, and I had a few pints myself. Where my dad had his last beers before that mission, which is, you know, pretty special.
You said in the book it had been open since like 1600 or
Oh
so.
yeah, yeah, it's hundreds of years old. Yeah, yeah. And you know, England, that was another thing that was new to the Americans going over there. You know, America is a new country, 200 years old then, and England's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, and so everything's old over there. And so, you know, in these little villages, and so that was another thing for the Americans to wrap their heads around.
Mhm.
But they took off on their mission to Frankfurt, Germany. And it was a beautiful day, clear sky. You know, looks like it's going to be a good mission. They dropped their bombs successfully, but their bomb bay doors got hit by anti-aircraft fire, flak. Flak was the German word for aircraft defense cannon, um, and or the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And they were deadly weapons. They fired 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that these bombers were flying. And these shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of razor sharp metal. They would just burst out hundreds of feet, you know, once they exploded, and could easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. The skin was so thin that you could take a screwdriver and just poke it right through it. But their bomb bay doors got hit by flak, and they couldn't get them back up. And as a result, that caused a drag in the plane, and they lost airspeed, and they fell behind the formation heading back to England. And they were singled out by two German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. and they came in for the kill. And they just made one pass. They came up underneath the plane and just riddled him. The Susan Ruth, the B-17, with their 20 millimeter cannons. And you know, all hell broke loose. My dad, as you mentioned earlier, wrote a diary while he was missing in action about the plane being attacked. And it's absolutely riveting. You know, my dad could have been a writer too, I think. I mean, he really describes this in detail. I mean, the co-pilot, George Ike, just froze with fear. The these When they fire these machine guns and these cannons, they have tracers, so they can see where their ammunition is going. And they lit the oxygen tanks on fire, and they exploded the oxygen tanks, and so there's fire in the cockpit. And my dad was, I guess, knocked unconscious for a few moments, but he wakes up and there's fire in the cockpit. Ike is just delirious with fear. And my dad, you know, kind of shaking off the cobwebs, and he's like all of a sudden in terror, and he's ripping at his trying to get his flak jacket off. They wore these flak jackets, which are like an apron with metal plates in the front and the back. They help protect him. But for some reason that day, he put his seatbelt on underneath his flak jacket instead of over it, and he couldn't undo it, which, you know, he's in a total panic now. And he doesn't know what's happening at all to the crew behind the bomb bay, because the intercom went out. You know, no one's responding to his call, and he realizes the plane's going to go down. He hits the bailout bell, you know, and speaks over the intercom, but he doesn't know if anyone's hearing him or nothing or not. The flight engineer is right behind him, so he can communicate with him, and then down below him, he can see and communicate with the navigator and the bombardier. Can't really see him in too well. But finally, he gets his seatbelt undone and throws off his flight jacket and takes off, gets Ike's attention and gets him calmed down. He does the same. He tries to put out the fire with a little extinguisher, but he says like it's like trying to put out a fire with a nose drop. That's all the more good it did. And so he's trying, you know, everyone's it's just chaos and everyone's scared to death. And so then finally they get their wits about him, and the four officers all bail out. And my dad doesn't know what happened to the guys in the back, but the belly gunner, Louis Colwart, is killed in the ball turret. And one of the waist gunners, I mean the radio operator, Ross Kaler, was also killed. Everyone's injured, some to more seriously than others. Joe Musial, the other waist gunner, has one of his feet almost shot off. It's just dangling by a tendon. The bombardier has his bicep ripped off from his arm. They're really serious injured, but their other 8 airmen are all able to bail out of the plane. So the way my dad describes this and the way Joe Musial also describes it, and the flight engineer, they all wrote accounts from this that are, you know, quotes in the book. It really gives a great description of what it was like, you know, when you're shot down and you're hit by enemy fighters, and your plane's going down and you have to bail out, and men have been killed. So that the book builds up to the day that the plane was shot down, and then the second half of the book is all about what happens afterwards. And
Right.
what happens to each member of my dad's crew, and then all the Belgian people that are involved in trying to help them. But my
One of
dad, go ahead.
sorry, one of the gentleman that almost lost his foot. Well, he ultimately did, but I believe it said that he stuck his foot out and it essentially froze the wound and did like a reverse cauterization, I guess, instead of fire, but with ice. I didn't
Right.
know that was they were like just like the handbook says. You know, the fact that the handbook said that to begin with kind of was blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah, they have this handbook and tell you what to do if you're shot down, but until you're shot down, um, you've never done it before. But yeah, he had the wits about him to stick his foot out, in that minus, 40 to 6 degree weather, so it froze, the blood right there. And then you also have to realize that any airman who bails out, they've never bailed out of a plane before. It's not like being a paratrooper where you practice, parachuting out of a plane. They had a little classroom education and they tell you like to count to 10 or you wait until you see, you can distinguish, objects on the ground. But these guys have never bailed out before and, they're scared to death and, they're worried about, their parachute opening to begin with, or falling clear of the plane, because there were guys that had their parachutes get caught on the plane and they were killed. So it's pure terror that these guys are going through, and but uh, of the 8 men, they all bailed out successfully and got down to the ground, and
Mhm.
then various things happened to each one of the guys.
So can you walk us through that just a little bit of I know that one thing that we've not talked about really here, but that is very clear in the book is that um, Ike and your dad were pretty close, and then his wife and your mom were also fairly close. Um, and there's a tragic story involving him and two others, I believe. So, as you mentioned, five died. So, two died in the plane, five survived, but then that leaves three that passed away that are so far unaccounted for.
Right. Yeah, my dad and Ike were very close because being co-pilots, they went to transitional crew training together. And uh, at transitional crew training in Pyote, Texas, and in Dalhart, Texas, an operational crew training where the crew came together, uh, the wives could be with the officers. And so my mother was with my dad, and Helen, George's wife, was with him. And so they would get together, as couples. So they were very close, and my dad and George were close because they're in the cockpit together, all those training hours together. Um, so yes, they were. When my dad came down, he didn't, really know where he was. He had no idea what happened to any other members of the crew after he bailed out. And he didn't know what happened to any of the gunners in the back at all. He
Mhm.
knew that the other three officers, the four officers all bailed out, but he came down by himself. So he's comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies, can't communicate with the U.S. military, um, and he's frightened to death because he knows there's going to be Germans, trying to find him after he bailed out. But fortunately for him, a couple young Belgian men came to his aid before the Germans could get there. My dad came down in trees, and his parachute got hung up on the branches, and he's dangling 20 feet off the ground and couldn't get down. But these two Belgian men, they went back to the farmhouse, got a ladder and a rope and helped him down a tree, and they told him to hide and stay put because this took place early in the afternoon, and they thought it was too dangerous to try to move him with German patrols combing the area. So they said they'd come back to get him that night, which they did. And three of the other men who bailed out, uh, two of the officers, or I should say Joe Musial, the guy that had his foot almost shot off, he was picked up right away by the Germans, and he wasn't going anywhere, any place. anywhere. He's trying to survive and live. Uh, 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 Richard Daniels, the bombardier who had his bicep, blown off, he's in no condition either. He's picked up right away by the Germans. And then Roy Holbert, who was the flight engineer, he's picked up right away by the Germans. So three of them are picked up by the Germans and become prisoners of war. Then the other men who bailed out, the tail gunner, Bill Schlenker, he also, like my dad, evaded capture. Um, he was hidden by Belgian people. And then the three other men, George Ike, Robert Benninger, the navigator, and John Pendrock, the waist gunner, they come down. They're picked up by the resistance. They're taken to some homes of some local people where they're hidden for a day or two. And then they're moved to a resistance camp where resistance fighters are staying. A number of other people are staying, people that are fleeing from the Germans, so they only get sent, don't become forced labor and sent back to Germany, guys that had escaped from prison camps. That camp's raided, so they all flee out. And eventually, the three of my dad's crew hook up with 5 other downed airmen from 3 other B-17s. And they're being helped by these members of the Belgian underground who build a makeshift hut for them in the forest outside of Chimay, Belgium, was just north of the French border. And so you had these 8 guys staying in this halfway submerged hut. They dug a big hole in the ground and then put boards over it and put tree branches so they couldn't be seen from the air. And these guys were hiding out in this hut, waiting, hoping to get into escape networks and back to England. In the occupied countries, these members of the underground and the resistance formed various escape networks, which would try to pick up downed airmen, British or US airmen, and get them back to England through these various escape routes, which would come down into France, over the Pyrenees, into neutral Spain, and then out through British-controlled Gibraltar. But these networks would get compromised occasionally, and or people killed, and they'd cease operation for a while or have to be delayed, and so they couldn't get out right away. So they 2 months later, on April 21st, when they had planned to get them in escape networks, unbeknownst to them, a Belgian collaborator told the Germans about them. And the Germans came down with all of these different units of the German and Nazi and military police and infantry, and they surrounded the hut and they captured the 8 airmen along with 2 Belgian men that were helping them. And they took the 8 airmen into the schoolhouse in Chimay, which is still there today. Actually, the location of the hut is still there today, too. There's a memorial there. They interrogated them, the 8 airmen. Then they drove them back out in the woods near the hut. And they had 2 Germans, they had assigned to each of the 8 airmen. And they started walking them off in different directions. And they shot all 8 airmen and murdered them. That's how the 3 other members of my dad's crew, Robert Benninger, George Ike, and John Pendrock, were killed, along with 5 other airmen from 3 other B-17s. So a tragic story.
Yeah.
We have the heroic story and, a happy ending of my dad and Bill Schlenker of missing in action for 7 months, but evading capture and making it back to the States. Bill Schlenker, he stayed with the same house the whole 7 months. He stayed with Josephine Coulet and her 2 daughters. He was only 19 years old, celebrated his 20th birthday with them. unlike Schlenker, my dad was moved from place to place to place, just constantly. Uh, how long he stayed in any given location depended on how brave the Belgian people who lived there and how dangerous the Belgian underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend a night, he might spend 6 weeks.
Mhm.
And then finally, my dad got tired of hiding. Word came on that the Allies had landed at Normandy on June 6th, and he decided to get back in the fight. Unlike most airmen, he had that year's experience in the army as trained as an infantryman, and so he knew how to fight on the ground. And he decided to join the French resistance, which is an unbelievably brave thing to do. The smartest thing and the safest thing was for him to just stay hunkered down and wait in hiding until the U.S. armies came up through France after D-Day. But he thought that there were Americans, fighting and dying for their country and for freedom, and he thought it was his duty to get back in the fight. And so he convinced one of his helpers, Amy Cools, to accompany him on bicycles, and they went over the border into France, and he hooked up with a unit of the French resistance and started sabotaging German convoys for a couple of months.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he could have died fighting against the Germans, or if the Germans captured him at that time, he would have been shot on the spot as a terrorist. So
Mhm.
unbelievably brave thing to do.
That is something that I had not heard before. What you just said, that the Germans considered these terrorists. That just, with modern day, that terminology just was interesting to me.
Right. Yeah. 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 It's totally different context as we think of terrorists today.
Mhm. It's
And
it's
then,
more saboteurs, but they
yeah,
classify it as terrorists. Yeah, when I read about Ike dying, I don't know why it caught me off guard so much. It's, like when you're watching a movie and you expect it to be a happy ending and then it's just not, and then the movie ends. That's kind of, I was like, wait, no. That was,
yeah, that's pretty shocking for people who get to that point in the book. Um, yeah, it so and then two of my dad, Joe Usual and Richard Daniels, were so injured, they were repatriated back to the U.S. before the war ended because of the seriousness of their wounds. There's no way they could, go back into the combat or fight against the Germans again. So they were put on a, a Swedish ship, uh, Red Cross ship, and they went back to the States in early 1945, January 45, before the war ended, and then convalesced back in the States.
yeah. One of the things that's so scary, I think, about the story is just how much of it is left up to chance. Like, there's a shortly after your dad crashes, he's walking through the town and he has to pretend to like ride this bicycle. Um, and his foot's injured. That was your dad, right? His foot's injured, but he can't he can't pedal all the way, so then he kind of has to lean on it and use it as crutches. And this German guy comes out drunk out of a bar, puts his arm around him and asks him in German for a light, but he doesn't speak German, and so he's terrified. But luckily, the guy that he's with does, and gives him a light, and he kind of gets out of it. But there are so many stories like that that are in this, and just in general, every time you read a story like this, how something happens to one person and skips the next. And it's like it's almost like trench warfare in a way, like the shell either hits you or it doesn't, and that's got to be terrifying, just waiting on pins and needles to see, is today going to be the day? Is it going to be, because I know a lot of the days just kind of were normal in a way. So is it going to be a normal day in this occupied environment, or is today it?
Yeah, he was almost discovered several times, and he was in hiding. Yeah, the instance you uh, just stated, that's he stayed in that farmhouse after he was first picked up, after he bailed out for one night. And then a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan, came in a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. And that's when they came to a hill and they couldn't pedal it up anymore. So they started pushing the bike up the hill, and they came to this little cafe, which is still there today, although it's been remodeled. Uh, and two German officers came out with these two young French girls. My dad said they were smashed, they were drunk, and then he comes up, puts his arm around my dad and asks for a light for a cigarette, which Paul lights for the guys, and they let them go on their way. My dad said they were too drunk and too interested in these French girls to pay much attention to a couple guys that were pushing a bike up in the rain in the middle of the night. And then he was taken to all these different locations. And being in hiding was really stressful for my dad because at any moment he could be captured. The Gestapo could come in and capture him, and he did have some close calls. And so, I think that's another reason why he decided, it was so stressful that hiding. I think he thought it was less stressful fighting, joining the French resistance and sabotaging German convoys than it was just waiting and waiting that you could be arrested, at any time. And then there's several, instances and encounters that described in the book that my dad and the resistance group had attacking German convoys, which are pretty thrilling. Then finally, 7 months after bailing out, word came that there were U.S. troops in the nearby village of Trelon, France, and he walked into town up to an army major. It was a unit of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day, identified himself, and then he hopped a ride on a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris, and then from Paris got on a transport to get back to England, back to safety.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was the luck of the draw, like you mentioned earlier. Some guys, died on the last mission before they could go back to the States. Other guys died on their very first mission. Some guys they were sick and didn't go on a mission, and the guy that filled in for them, the plane went down and he was killed. Or that guy lucked out, the guy that was sick, but the guy that filled in for him, then he filled on one mission, and then that goes down. So it was just the luck of the draw.
Another thing I think it's really difficult to understand is just the danger that the people in the resistance put themselves in to help.
Oh, unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of their family and friends, because if the Gestapo, the secret police, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either sent to a concentration camp or shot. And some of the people who helped my dad and other members of his crew did meet that fate. Paul Tilcan, a Belgian customs officer that came on the tandem bicycle to help my dad, a couple months later, he was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to prison and tortured. And he narrowly escaped being executed. But because of the beatings he took on his head, he developed a brain tumor and died just a few years after the war. So those people were unbelievably brave people. My dad, he never forgot them. He corresponded with the people he stayed with lengthy periods of time, after the war, uh, exchanged Christmas cards, went over and revisited them after the war. Yeah, unbelievably. And I'm friends now with some of the grandkids of those people who helped my dad, which are really special bonds. But they let him sleep in their bed. They'd sleep on the floor. All food was rationed at that time. So food was hard to come by, but they'd give him, a larger portion, and they would go hungry, so, clothe him. So yeah, they unbelievably brave people.
Mhm. And there are several families that are in the book that you mentioned what happens to them afterwards, and it is very often not a happy story. There's
Right.
one family that the father's taken to a concentration camp and hung. There's a 22-year-old son that's also taken to a camp, and the wife and mother is sent to Ravensbrück, which is this kind of notorious women's concentration camp. And the ones that do survive, they often, well, I don't know often, but there were a couple of instances in your book where they end up committing suicide at some point. And it's they went through a lot. And the book kind of finishes off with this this overwhelming sense of gratitude and appreciation from these people, but it goes both ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the occupied people in the occupied countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, northern France, they know what it's like to lose all their freedoms completely.
Mhm.
And to this day, they are still so thankful and so grateful for the Americans and the Allies coming to rescue them from 4 years of Nazi occupation and Nazi oppression. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations to remember. Dr. Paul Delahaye formed the American Belgium Foundation and erected a number of memorials in the area. Um, to various events, including a memorial to my dad and his crew, and memorials to those airmen that were murdered in the woods. And on the anniversary dates of those events, they have ceremonies. Um, the biggest ceremonies are all centered around September 2nd, which was the day that that area of Belgium was liberated from the Nazis. And
Mhm.
I've been to Belgium 7 times, been to a number of those ceremonies, and they're just wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, they're very moving. They're both happy events because celebrating the liberation, where they have band concerts and parties and dinners, and the local beer Chimay just flows, and everyone has a great time. But then they have very solemn moments where they have these ceremonies at various memorials to remember and honor, the people who lost their lives
Mhm.
um, trying to defend freedom.
When are these? Is it typically around D-Day or is it around the time of liberation?
Well, it depends on the what what date the event took place. Actually, on Normandy around D-Day, they have big celebrations. In fact, I'm going back over this June. On June 5th, they're dedicating a memorial to the 8th Air Force at Normandy. And I'm going to attend that ceremony and then go on up to Belgium after that. That'll be my eighth trip. On February 8th, they have a ceremony every year. February 8th, and usually the weather's horrible, where all the local villagers come out and they have a little memorial ceremony at the memorial itself in Macanoise, Belgium, which is uh, near where the plane came down, the Susan Ruth came down. The U.S. Local U.S. Air Force Base comes down with the color guard, and then they have a little reception afterwards. The big ceremony in that area, though, is September 2nd, which is when the 9th U.S. Infantry first crossed over from France over the Wartros River into Belgium to liberate the little village of Cendron. Um, so that's when those ceremonies last several days, because they have celebrations and parties and ceremonies at different locations. There's a little museum there that has a lot of history of what happened during World War II, and also uh, uh, has a display and information about what happened to the crew of the Susan Ruth. So I've made some lifelong friends there, and it's just wonderful going back there. Yeah, it's never soon enough to go back and attend those ceremonies and see these people. These grandkids or of helpers of my dad's. We're like an extended family. Because their father or mother or grandmother or grandfather told them about pilot Howard Snyder, and my dad told us about the Bayous or the Delahayes or the Gadens, or what other people, Eva Martin and her daughters. Um, so it's just really special.
Yeah. So you mentioned some lifelong friends that you made, but you also connected with the son of the pilot that shot your father down.
The pilot himself.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, and that was pretty amazing. All my dad knew and the Air Force knew is that They were shot down by two German Focke-Wulf fighters, and that's all I thought I'd ever know. But one day, my wife, Glenda, says to me, "Well, why don't you?" When I'm doing my research, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot your dad down? I'm thinking, oh gosh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's naive, she means well, but it'd be impossible. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger. Um, I Googled trying to find a German Luftwaffe pilot. A couple forums came up, which I joined, and I posted inquiries on those forums because I knew the day he was shot down, the time of day he was shot down, the location of where he was shot down. And in a week, two guys got back to me, one from Belgium and one from England. On that day, 12 B-17s were shot down, and the one that was shot down south of Chimay, Belgium, was shot down by Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, Hans became a translator after the war and speaks perfect English. And he told me that the gunners on my dad's plane shot him down at the same time he shot my dad down. They shot each other down. He had to bail out, and then were picked up by Germans because they were occupying Belgium, and they got back to his unit, and we became friends. I made a couple trips over to Munich, Germany to visit him. He gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it was like going up against the 8th Air Force. When I went over to Belgium this last year for the 80th anniversary celebrations, I had hoped to visit Hans one last time, but unfortunately, he died last uh, January of 2024 at age 100. So I wasn't able to see him one last time. But that I was so excited when I found him. He was part of my dad's life. One moment in time, he and his life and my dad's life crossed paths. And so he was part of my dad's story. So I felt a real kinship toward Hans. And he was, pretty much just like the U.S. airman, 19, 20 years old, trying to do a job, fighting for his country, trying to stay alive. He said it was unfortunate they had to be shooting at each other, but that was war.
Mhm.
But that's one of the highlights of my life, meeting and getting to know Hans Berger.
And he was considered an ace, wasn't he?
Yeah, he shot down 7 B-17s and one British Spitfire. He was shot down 3 times himself. The only reason I think he made it through the war is that at the beginning of 1945, they pulled him out of combat to become a test pilot for the Henkel HE-162 single-engine jet fighters that the Nazis were trying to perfect, which they never did. But if he had stayed in combat, he would have died in all probability in 1945. So that
Yeah.
pretty much saved his life. He has
Yes.
quite an interesting story himself.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. One of the things that you mentioned in the book that we discussed earlier was the 25 combat mission limit for US troops, but there was no equivalent for the Germans. I think you
Now
say
they,
in the book it was, what is it, fly or die or fly till you
yeah, just fly until you die, or you're so injured so badly that you can't fly anymore. And that was, one of well, the Germans, the Luftwaffe had two big problems. One, that all their experienced pilots were killed,
die.
and they didn't have enough fuel to train newer pilots. So toward the end of the war, I mean, these German pilots, these young German pilots had hardly any training at all. And they were going up against these American pilots who were, hardened combat veterans, and they were just like fodder. The U.S. fighters were just shooting these guys down, before they didn't have a chance.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the last things is you are a member of AFES. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, AFES, yeah.
Air
Yeah,
Force.
that's Air Force Escape and Evasion Society. And that was made up of men who were shot down and evaded capture, and also Belgium or any uh, Belgian or French or Dutch person, who was in the underground who aided down airmen.
Mhm.
So I went to, my dad was a member of that. I'm still a member of that. They'd have reunions. So that's kind of a unique group.
Mhm.
And I'm also on the board of directors of the 8th Air Force Historical Society, and I'm president of the 306 Bomb Group Historical Association. So this is my life to keep the memory alive. And then I do a lot of speaking, uh, make PowerPoint presentations to all sorts of groups about the shot down story and about the air war over Europe.
Yeah, well, this is a it's a very important story. It's one that I don't think is discussed enough, especially as we start to get further away from World War II. You know, the major events stick in your head, um, but there are events that were just as major, but they kind of drop off over time. You know, you remember D-Day, you remember Iwo Jima, of course, you
Right.
remember the A bombs. Um, but as we start to get further and further away, everything outside of that just kind of is starting to fall off. So I think it's really important to continue to talk about this. And there are such amazing stories. And I mean, it was, you know, a global war. That's
Yeah, there was no other event in history that affected more people. I mean, 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were, homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever.
Mhm.
There really basically wasn't one country that wasn't affected by this. Even like in South America, they sent soldiers to fight uh, in the war. So it affected everybody.
Mhm. Um, Last question. Did your dad ever talk about the war? Did he ever, was there any signs of trauma? Or I know some people just don't really talk about it at all. Some people are very candid about their experiences. What was his life like afterwards?
Well, yeah, I mean, so many people, and 99% of the time, it's good. My dad never talked about the war, in
Mhm.
which most guys did not. My dad was proud of his service. Um, he loved his country. And so I knew the basics growing up. Uh, that he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England. He was shot down. He was missing in action for 7 months. He fought with the underground. These guys, other guys were killed. But it wasn't until 1989 when Dr. Delahaye and the Belgium American Foundation erected the memorial to my dad and his crew. And my dad and the three other members of the crew who were still living at the time went over with their wives for the dedication. And there he was reunited with all these Belgian people that hid him and revisited these places where he was hidden. And that brought it all back. And then he started talking about it after that. And then 5 years later, I made my first trip to Belgium with my parents in 1994. And that's when it became personal for me because I went around with my dad, you know, met a couple of my dad's helpers, the wife of Paul Tilcan, Nellie Tilcan, and saw these places where it was hidden. And that's, when it became meaningful and personal to me.
Mhm.
Um, So as I mentioned earlier, I'm so blessed and so fortunate to know so much about not only my father, but about his other crew members and about all these Belgian people that helped him. It's just I'm one in a million that can say that uh, that because most people their vet didn't talk about it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when you're young, you just don't think of asking questions about it until it's too late.
Mhm.
And so that uh, was unfortunate. And then having all those letters, that were so candid, is just another, blessing that I have that, other people really don't have. People I know people that have written books that, just combine all the letters and basically it's just writing back home and, we did this in training or, went to this movie tonight or, and it's doesn't really tell you much about what actually went on during the war.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think there was like a commanding general, and it was in World War I. I don't remember if it was the Somme or Verdun, and he kept a daily diary during this major battle, and all he said was what the weather was like.
Yeah, yeah.
That was it. So the fact that you have all of this information and then compiled additional information, and then did something with it, a lot of people do have information, but they don't have the desire or whatever to actually publish it so that others can read it. So thank you for doing that. It's really a gift to military history and historians, I think.
Yeah, it was a labor of love. I mean, I did it after I retired, and there's no way I could have done it while I was, working my career job, because it takes so much, effort and so much work and so much time. But fortunately, uh, I did do it. It's unfortunate that, I couldn't have done this while my dad was still alive. Man, would I love to have him going on book tour with me,
Mhm.
sitting next to me, signing copies of the book. Now I sign him, but man, he would have loved to have talked to people about his experiences.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure he's very proud of you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. I learned so much from your book and from you, and I'm so glad that you took the time to do this with me. Thank you so much.
Well, I thank you for your interest. Thank you for reading the book. Thanks for having me on your podcast, and it's been a lot of fun. You did a great job of just having the conversation flow.
Thank you. That I appreciate that. That means a lot.
Yeah, this 2 hours is going by in a flash, really.
I know, yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm going to go onto your website and I'm going to order a signed copy of your book and I'm going to put it down in my library with all of my other World War II books. And this one's going to be special because it's going to be signed.
That's great. Yeah, it's wonderful that I have all those pictures too. That's because there's over 200 time period photographs, and many of the photos taken by Belgian people, during the war in 1944, which are just priceless. That were either sent to my dad from his helpers or uh, provided to me by Dr. Delahaye and Jacques Lelot.
Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to see those because I listened to the audiobook, so I didn't get to see any pictures.
Yeah, because then you can visualize everything you're reading about, so it makes it
Right.
nice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Well,
thank
thanks
you so
again.
much. Have a great day. I really appreciate this. Thanks so much.